Breakfast Live Online. Today is Wednesday, October 25th, 2023. And we are in, I guess it's about the fourth or fifth week of webinar mode for our Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We've been doing this program, BBLO or Broadband Breakfast Live Online, for 3.5 years since the pandemic began in earnest in America in March of 2020. And we started this program, which kind of builds on the news and reporting that we do at broadbandbreakfast.com, covering infrastructure, adoption and use, and big tech and their impact on our lives. And the Broadband Breakfast Live Online program has kind of helped bring this community together. It's a discussion. It can be a debate. Isn't always a debate, but many times it's a debate. But it's also about sort of thinking about commonalities, consensus opinions around a particular topic. We kind of rotate between infrastructure topics, which I think today's discussion on railroads and rights of way falls in that bucket. But we also talk a lot about issues of broadband adoption use, like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which we did a session on not too long ago. And I'm pretty soon, as soon as I finish my opening thoughts, I'll put a couple links in the chat stream for those of you who are watching on Zoom. We also live stream this program on other platforms, including LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter or X, and Facebook. So you can sort of see us and make comments and questions on those other platforms as well. There tends to be more of a discussion on this one just because it enables it the most, but all are available. And importantly, the recordings of these events are available immediately afterwards on Broadband Breakfast. So if you missed one or you missed this one, you can come back and watch it. So two or three more quick things before we get to our topic today. Broadband Breakfast is pleased to be a media sponsor of Vaughan Evolution. This is a conference that has a very esteemed history and sort of took a bit of a hiatus, produced by Jeff Pulver and his Pulver Studios. It's in New York City. So I will be up in New York City and I'll be doing a session with Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners and Stealth ISP, two New York-based broadband players, one an ISP and one a funder of infrastructure. And we're going to be talking about building beyond BEAD, right? And BEAD being, of course, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And there's many other things in that show that Jeff has put together. Vaughan Evolution. There's a link to it on Broadband Breakfast's email blast, and we will be putting ad links up as well so that you can go to sign up for and use the Broadband Breakfast registration code. But save the date, go to New York. I'll be there. It'll be a fun time at Vaughan Evolution next Wednesday and Thursday, I guess Tuesday as well, but I'll be up there Wednesday and Thursday, November 1st and November 2nd. It's also less than 3 weeks away from the Connect 20 Summit. This is a very exciting event that we are, again, kind of pleased to partner with other entities on. You can find the link for the Connect 20 Summit in the upper right corner of Broadband Breakfast. I will put this in the chat stream for the Zoom viewers. It's actually a 2-day event, but we're really kind of focusing on the first day because that's the one with the program that is focused around digital navigators and their role in helping to close the digital divide. I just put the link for that into the Zoom chat. I'll put it in the other chat when I have a moment. It's basically a half day on Tuesday, November 14th. We're doing it in collaboration with Connect 20 and also, I guess Connect 20 is the name of the summit. We're doing it in partnership with the Network On entity with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And all the details are on the site. It is freely available to register and attend in person or online. We will be live streaming it for those of you who are not in Washington or not able to easily make it there. And then, and we're very excited, more details will be forthcoming this week on, but save the date, Tuesday, December 5th is our annual Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. It will be at Clyde's of Gallery Place, as we've had it in the past and had several other events this year. We had a very exciting, very grateful for the turnout we had in September for the BEAD Implementation Summit, and this will just build on top of that, and we'll be talking about the intersection of the financing and the operations necessary for the digital infrastructure assets we need to advance to the future. In fact, we're going to be doing a preview session on the summit 2 weeks from today on November 8th. Next week, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity. And while cybersecurity is kind of a good thing to talk about all the time, it's particularly a good thing to talk about in regards to BEAD. Okay. And again, BEAD is something we're just, like I don't know, bread on butter or whatever. We everything BEAD you can find at Broadband Breakfast, right? And so we want you to think of and associate your solutions to BEAD with Broadband Breakfast. And this session on November 1st, so a week from today, will be on cybersecurity and BEAD and how network operators need to submit comprehensive cybersecurity strategies to qualify for BEAD funding. So that's what the focus of next week's free weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online. And I guess just before we now turn to our panelists, I want to thank our sponsors that enable us to do this free programming on Broadband Breakfast Live Online every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern. Our sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, DCS Technologies, Nokia, BroadbandToolkit.com, the ComLog Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, and Positron Access. Thank you to each of our sponsors for your support. Now, with that, let's go ahead and open up our gallery for our panelists. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then they will offer some opening thoughts on this topic. And as always, we try to get a diversity of viewpoints on every topic we discuss, and we certainly tried to get a diversity on this viewpoint. We may not have succeeded as well as we would have liked, but that's on those who chose not to participate. So for this discussion, we're going to hear first from Alan Poole. Alan is a partner at Troutman Pepper, and as a full service law firm, Troutman Pepper works on many issues, but Alan in particular has focused on tough problems in infrastructure. And Alan in particular specializes in fiber optic and other linear networks and has experience covering electric utilities, broadband, local government, real estate, corporate, and transactional law. And so thank you to Alan for being part of our discussion, setting the table for us. He is an attorney, so he can hopefully talk of some of the potentially thorny issues in right-of-way law that are going to come up in our discussion today about railroad crossings and the broadband rights of way. And then Alan will be followed by Carolyn Booth Olson. Carolyn has had a lot of experience on Capitol Hill, and she's worked for conservative members of Congress. I'm sure that's not a great place to be today, but be that as it is, we are glad that you're with us today, Carolyn. And she's worked for Pete Sessions and Liz Cheney, who actually, become a bit of a celebrity since events, shall we say, of the last 2 years. But we're very excited to have someone with your depth of experience working on Congress. And she is now, of course, Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs at Encompass, which, if memory serves me correctly, is the Internet Competition Association, right? I didn't even know that was like an acronym until a year or so ago. But anyway, thank you for being with us, Caroline, and giving your perspective on this important issue. And then batting cleanup will be Gary Wood. Okay, and we have a real practitioner in the field from Virginia, which is kind of one of the hot spots right now. So very excited that Gary Wood, the president and CEO of the Central Virginia Electric Cooperative and its wholly owned subsidiary, Firefly Fiber Broadband. What a great name, Gary. Firefly Fiber, I love it. And Firefly began building fiber in August of 2018. And since that time, your co-op has built more than 5,000 miles of fiber and made gigabit speeds available to more than 55,000 locations in Central Virginia. So thank you for doing that, for goodness. I mean, thank you for connecting people to broadband. That's really so important. We got to remember that and come back to that. So with that intro, let's go ahead and turn over to you to take a little bit of time, Alan, to set the table for us. Why are we talking about railroad and rights of way? Why is that important? Over to you.
Well, it's really interesting. Going back 10 years ago when I started practicing in this field, the big thing was pole attachments, and it still is today. But you talk to people back then, and the prevailing thought among operators, as far as I could tell, was the railroads just are not something that have been touched, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But since then, we've had a number of flashpoints and developments of connectivity technology that have necessitated a new look at certain things. Certainly, local government right of way had a big was under the eyeglass during the BEAD days of 5 or 6 years ago, and with COVID happening, with significant government funding, I kind of always thought we'd start looking at this a lot more, because if we have the public funding going towards building networks, I would think that at least the federal government would be really interested in making sure it's not being misused. And sure enough, in the NTIA's NOFO, they started trying to shape this policy by indicating that one of the points that could go towards or against the state's plan is, what are they doing to identify barriers in deployment? Now, even before this time, we started seeing some states pass laws that regulate railroad crossings, and there's just a handful. I don't think we're even quite at half, but I'll be talking about that a little bit. But the big news right now, obviously, is Virginia. That used to be Norfolk Southern's headquarters. They've since moved, and it was a bit politically a bit of a surprise that this got done. But Virginia has been very progressive about broadband expansion. So really, I think that to me signals that it's time to address this issue one way or another, and there's many different ways it could go. So I'll talk about the crossing law, and then the lawsuit that's going on right now, and then a little bit about other states. The main attributes of the crossing law are the process. Broadband providers have to submit an application to the railroad, which has to be complete for the process to start. There's a shot clock. That's another common theme. Dealing with railroads not just ends up being expensive, but produces costly delays. So many states, including Virginia, try and address that with a shot clock. So for Virginia, the railroad must confirm receipt, may request clarification within 15 days, and must respond. The provider has to respond within 10. Railroad has to approve within 35 days unless there's an issue. If there's an issue, they can petition the State Utilities Commission, which is another common theme. The state is attempting to cap fees at $2,000 for a private crossing, but it goes lower if it's abandoned, only $1,000. And another common theme is we're really trying to get at, what is this right of way? So if the right of way is public right of way, there may be no fee. Now, to protect the constitutional interests in the railroad's property, they have the ability to get an exception if that fee just does not compensate them from the state or federal constitution standpoint. They can petition to the Virginia SCC. That law was supposed to go in effect July 1st. The American Association of Railroads has filed a lawsuit in June 2023. The arguments include that this process singles out and imposes a higher burden on railroads than other similarly situated private property owners. This is more or less a condemnation effort, which is common in the utility space. The aggressive timeframes pose undue safety risks. There's no public use, which to have any condemnation, the use has to be public. They're arguing that broadband is a private use and not a public one. And they're arguing that the remedy law that the railroads are provided to protect their constitutional interests, again, for example, saying for this particular crossing, we need more time, or we need more money, or insufficient because they have to go file endless lawsuits. state has filed a motion to dismiss. Not going to try and predict where it goes. I think a number of claims are going to be knocked out on sovereign immunity, probably not all. The interesting thing about this to me is that the railroad is really calling the question on certain key items that need to be figured out in every state. Specifically, what is the nature of the right-of-way? It's private, but it's also kind of not private. As the state identified in its motion to dismiss, it's quasi-private, it's a public utility, it's publicly regulated. The railroad is for a public purpose. And in many cases, the right-of-way for the railroad was established via condemnation. So it's only natural. The state and the industry argues that there might be another condemnation for a similar purpose. We have a pretty good log of other states that have similar regulations. I'll talk about some of the things we've seen and some of the things that we don't see that may cause a problem. On process, how do you actually resolve these issues? You can regulate all you want. There's always going to be disputes. There's always going to be special circumstances. And most states will kick that to the Public Service or Utility Commission, the great majority. Illinois is a bit of an outlier. It imposes arbitration, which has both good and bad aspects. Since speed is a factor, there are often shot clocks. You usually see 60 to, once you get to the state commission level, especially, you don't want that to fall into a drawer somewhere. So many states have imposed a 60 or 120-day deadline for utility commissions to respond. We're seeing many shot clocks. Railroads must have, and that usually applies to some parts of the process, not all. Like approving the application, you usually have 30 to 35-day period. After that, I don't know that we have seen a regulation that says there's a particular timeline for construction, and that is an area where even with state regulation, you could run into issues. Issues include both time to one of the biggest issues we're seeing is the availability of flagmen or other contractors needed on the railroad side. And, one of the things that I wonder if we'll see be addressed is borrowing from the pole attachments arena, whether we'll see some sort of approved contractors list where, some providers have argued, okay, well, Railroad X uses a single company and that they're nationwide, but we have another contractor that can do the same thing. That's an area we haven't seen delved into very much, but that could change as time goes on. Fees range anywhere from $750 to $2,000, but that fee covers the use of the right-of-way. Now, that does not necessarily include expenses on top of that, which if your legislation doesn't do that, you may end up running up a huge bill anyways. But most states include the direct expenses of the railroad and the crossing fee, while Virginia allows up to $5,000 in addition to the crossing fee. And again, usually you can go to someone, the commission perhaps, for an exception. Another issue is who gets the benefit of this regulation. Now, broadband has always been in kind of a strange place because in order to let the business thrive, we've tried to not regulate it. But with regulation, especially in the telecom world, sometimes comes special rights. So if you're looking, the traditional telecom and cable providers all have special rights at the federal and state level that broadband only providers may not have. But luckily, since this is a new issue, most states are including broadband only providers, but some states, Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, only apply to utilities or telecom providers. Now, the question is, can you execute a strategy as a broadband only provider that gets you under that umbrella? And that's a tricky and key issue we help a lot of providers with. So as to not take up too much time, I'm going to go over some real world stuff because regulation or no, this can be still a really thorny issue, and we're often called to help smooth things over or resolve disputes. So what if there's no specific regulation?
Can I suggest this, Alan?
Yes.
Thank you for taking this additional time to kind of walk us through this. I think that's really set the table. Let's get the perspective of Caroline and Gary in, and then we'll come back to this point by point, because again, it's worth drilling in. This is a very complicated issue, and it's clearly an issue on the mind of state broadband directors, right? And I know you can speak to that, Gary, right? But thank you, Alan, for giving those opening remarks. May we turn it now to Caroline Olson to tell us a little bit about how this issue plays out in the aspect of Encompass member companies.
Of course. Thank you, Drew. And I will be brief with my opening remarks. It is a pleasure to be with everyone today. And again, thank you, Drew, for inviting me to take part in this critical discussion. At our core, Encompass is focused on advocating for competitive policies that ensure all Americans have access to affordable, fast, reliable connectivity. And to further that mission, we focus on reducing barriers to deployment, whether that's access to poles, right-of-ways, or like we're talking about today, crossing the railroad. And with the historic amount of resources from both the Infrastructure Act and private equity, we have the opportunity to bridge the digital divide and connect all Americans. However, barriers to deployment are a huge impediment to reaching that goal, specifically when it comes to railroads. Now, when I started, I guess in January now, we had our policy summit in March, and a number of our members came up to us and were talking about their problems with the railroads. And this is a tale as old as time, but it was really brought to the forefront during our advocacy on our lobby day. And so we brought them to the Hill, and they talked about how railroads are really harming their ability to deploy. We have a vast membership with members all over the country. And so here's just a few of their challenges that they faced. Currently, we have a member who's building 455 miles of fiber in Georgia. Now, they started this process about 18 months ago, and they've applied for roughly 1,400 permits between the Army Corps, state right-of-ways, municipalities, and our friends with the railroads. And out of those 1,400 permits, they're only waiting on 5. And guess who those 5 belong to? The railroads. So, I mean, that's just a crazy amount of time to spend dragging their feet on 5 things that they started over a year and a half ago. In Indiana, we have a company who's in a legal battle right now with the railroads over whether or not they need further authority from them to operate in a public right-of-way, which they already have sufficient authority to be in. In California, we have another member who is charged $47,000 for one crossing. And now in Florida, another member had to cough up $30,000 for one crossing. And in most cases, as Alan was saying, it's not just the crossing fee, they tack on other fees, such as the insurance fee, where we've seen anything from $1,250 to $4,500 per crossing. So this problem isn't just costing companies money and time, it's actually creating a deterrence and causing people to start mapping out their networks to avoid crossing any railroads. And in many cities, the railroad is a dividing line. So if we're truly trying to bridge the digital divide, the railroad should not be the thing that stands in our way. So for the last 7 months, we've been working on a federal solution. Congressman Troy Balderson from Ohio has really been a great champion for us in the House. And in May, the House Energy and Commerce Committee had a broadband permitting package. They had about 34 bills, and we were able to get an amendment into that package to address this very issue. So the amendment passed via voice vote, so bipartisan support. That package is currently waiting to be considered on the House floor. Who knows when that will be, since things are still shut down over there. Sounds like they're starting to open them back up, but who knows? So that was a great win for us, but we really didn't want to stop there. We know legislation takes a long time, so we wanted to put every resource we could into this. So we started working on the Senate side as well to take the Balderson Amendment and make it into a bipartisan, bicameral initiative, really flesh it out, give it some more teeth, and just get it introduced. So we're working with some great partners in the Senate right now. We are having discussions with the FCC, the FRA, to really provide that regulatory framework necessary to ensure that broadband and telecom providers aren't charged unnecessary fees, their deployment is not impeded, and any fees that they are charged are based on actual real costs specifically related to that deployment. So as I said, we're working on this initiative. I'm hoping we can drop it before the end of the year. We have some really good momentum on our side right now. So as soon as we do, I'll make sure to circulate it to everyone and scream it from the rooftops. But I think this will be a really great solution that will help a number of providers deal with this issue, in addition to the state laws on the books.
And by drop it, of course, you're using the Capitol Hill industry
Introduce
terminology,
it.
which is
Yeah.
introduced as not abandoned. No, it's the opposite of abandoned. It's
I'm
move
sorry.
forward. No, it's okay. It's okay. We
Yes,
just like
full
to
steam
define our
ahead.
terms. We just like to explain our terms and make sure
Yeah.
that they're understood. Thank you so much. And a lot of great facts. I've got a zillion questions I want to ask, but let's get to the practitioner in the field, Gary Wood, and hear some of the stories you've encountered in Virginia, and in particular, the law that again, Alan has ably documented. What kind of led to this law, and what do you hope comes from it if it ever goes into effect? So Gary, over to you. Make sure you're off mute, Gary.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. I talk a lot, and so sometimes people want to have a mute button on me. So, but thanks for having me on and for giving us a chance to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we've had. And the railroads, a lot like the other parts of the different industries that are impacted by a really fast build out, I think they've had a hard time catching up. Try to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I think we need some tools to help encourage them to look at their processes, look at their costs, and think about how they fit into the broadband solutions, particularly in rural America, which is where I am. So I'm going to go back to a big driver for this, for us, is the funding sources and the timelines that come with it. And I'll go back to CARES funding, the first significant funds that came out during COVID. And during COVID, it became very apparent that broadband in rural areas was not just a nicety, but was an essential service. Schools were closed, students were supposed to be working online. In our rural county, the limited options for Wi-Fi were at one McDonald's that's in our county and the local library. So we had people driving 20 miles with families and sitting for hours in order to get homework done. We had CARES funding, and every one of our projects, we stopped at the railroad tracks because it needed to be done in 3 to 4 months. And we knew it was just impossible. We didn't even try to cross the tracks. After that, there were some sources of funds that gave a little more leeway. And we received some funds, federal funds through a county locally, where we had a year timeline to build. And we started the application process when we first got the funding. We built to one side of the tracks. We skipped over because we didn't have the crossing permit. We built the entire other side of the tracks that was in a low and moderate income neighborhood, about 300 homes. That was ready to be connected in May. We got those connected right at year end, December, and that was only after jumping up and down and pounding on the table. That's one full semester with students who didn't have access because they're on the wrong side of the tracks. That doesn't need to happen. Most of these crossings for us are where there is an existing crossing in place. There's already an electric line across the tracks. So the question is just about having taller poles, moving that crossing up and putting one more fiber underneath that needs to have the 27 feet clearance. I work in the utility industry, the electric industry. We understand the safety concerns. We work around railroads. We work around high voltage. It's dangerous every day. We're willing to work with the railroads on making sure things are safe and well planned, and there's no additional danger to them or to anyone working on the project. But we need to be able to do that faster. We also need to not have some of the silliness that happens when you have abandoned tracks, you have old depot areas. We had another underground job. It was underground. We were building next to a state road. And the state first gave us heads up and said, you can build up to here, but then you run into railroad right away. You need a railroad permit. I hadn't even thought about the railroad, which was 250 or 300 feet away. We were running parallel to it. We never crossed the railroad. We had to get a $20,000 railroad permit and wait for flaggers to come up to flag in case a train was going 300 feet away so that we could dig next to the road and put our fiber in. Some of those types of things, first of all, you should be able to handle quicker because that type of review should move fairly quickly. You're going to be 300 feet away. You're going to be doing underground. You're not coming anywhere close to the danger in the train. And secondly, some of the costs. I understand they own that right of way and they deserve some benefit for the use of it. But I think tying it back to what's reasonable. We have crossed places where we serve 1,000 people on the other side of the tracks and paid the same fee as when we cross and serve one family. We paid the same thing for overhead where there's an existing right-of-way or for underground. Not only that, when we're going overhead, we also, our Firefly subsidiary is building on other utilities than just our parent utility. So when we build in the American Electric Power service area, American Electric Power is charged a fee to put 2 poles in and raise their wires. Then we are charged a fee for the very same crossing to put our fiber under it. So there's some real challenges, some opportunities to streamline that. And we really need some of the tools that Alan and Carolyn have been talking about so we can move quickly because all of the money comes with funding. The state of Virginia has been very aggressive and done an excellent job getting funding out and pushing forward on broadband. There was $700 million from American Rescue Plan funds that were released in 2022 that we have anywhere from 18 months to 36 months to build, depending on the size of the project. The BEAD funding is going to also have a timeline. We have to get these things moving quicker and get them resolved faster so that we can get service out. Even more important than when the money runs out is all of these families are still waiting with no other access. They're in the United States of America and they can't get online and get homework done. They can't do the things that you need to do, whether you're trying to work remotely, telemedicine for some of our seniors, all the things that broadband brings. And the impediment of crossing the tracks is one of the few that we can't option our way around. If pole attachments become too expensive or take too long, you can get underneath. But you can't get to the other side of the tracks without a crossing. So
right.
Something that really needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you again. And I do have to ask here, are you, is this a live background and not a Zoom background, Gary?
This is a picture from my office, but because of the glare of the sun, if I take the background off, you're going to get the glare. But this is what I look out at.
Well,
see, we've got to build broadband up there because there's none up there. You can't see it in the picture, right?
It's a marvelous background and a reminder that obviously we have a beautiful country. We just need to make sure we get broadband everywhere in it. Now, I'm going to start with a bit of a strange question. I've been covering telecom law and politics for 20 years, or at least, maybe more, other tech issues. And when I first heard about the role of railroads and broadband, it was from the standpoint of vertical assets, right? Like the vertical assets that railroads have in their vertical, like, or along a track right of way, and how that might be used or repurposed for fiber middle mile, right? And I think there may have been some projects that haven't followed it super closely. So distinguish, and let's let Alan go first, distinguish what is the right of way in a vertical asset versus like who has the right of way in a horizontal crossing. We're talking about like when there's a road, right? There's obviously a public right of way across the railroad. So like, isn't there a different legal standard or test in the ownership of the vertical right of way versus the horizontal right of way, Alan?
You often do see that. The public road is a type of right of way that is dedicated to a local government, and the meaning of the use of the permitted uses of that road, that type of right of way have changed over time, but in most states they have come to permit communication. So in essence, many times that we've had great success dealing with this issue is because we're crossing a public right of way. Now, it's always great if there's actually laws on the books saying that. Sometimes you're having to point back to a 1911 Supreme Court of, whatever state decision, and that may not be as persuasive. But in theory, and you see this in the reflected in the legislation, there's a good argument that there should be no fee if what you're really doing is piggybacking along an established right of way.
Well, I mean, another way of putting this, and again, we certainly reached out to railroads to participate in this discussion, and we'd like to have them back at some future time so I could ask them this question. But how is it that railroads who might have been seen as like a real accelerant or potential accelerant for middle mile deployments, how come they have come to be seen, whether it's true or not, I'm not saying, as a obstacle and a troll, basically, blocking passage of many broadband deployments? Let's let everyone tackle that question.
Well, I think that the two key issues are, this is not their business, and the way that any utility model business works is you get kind of a monopoly and you protect it by being fierce about how you protect it. And that causes just a way of thinking to put, and I'm putting on a bit of a railroad hat here, not that I represent them in this matter. You put that over, everything to protect your business. And when you have a competing, the seriousness of the competing interest here, I think, is in part hindered by how we've just not wanted to give a public utility status to broadband for all the problems that may cause if you do it. That has been seen as, this is just a nice thing. Now, obviously, we don't think that anymore after COVID, but it's taken a while for that to catch up.
Gary and Carolyn, what are your perspective on this? Are there ways in which you do interact in positive ways with railroads, and what could be done to encourage more collaborative interactions?
I think Alan is correct in saying this isn't their business. So a lot of our members say that their concerns or their permitting application goes at the bottom of the stack because it's like, we'll deal with them when we need to deal with them. We got bigger fish to fry, and there's no real accountability for them in how long they take to process the application. It's really no skin off their back. So they just kind of ignore them. And then when they do deal with them, for the most part, they're awful to deal with. We've heard very, very few good stories from our members, but the good stories come from the local people on the ground who have those relationships directly with the people at the railroad. So it's a very, 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 very few and far between. But that's been our members' experiences.
Gary.
And I'm going to just follow on to what Carolyn said there. We have had some good experiences, and they're with the short track local providers in Buckingham County, Virginia. We serve about 2,000 locations, and we needed to cross Buckingham branch tracks in several places, and several of those crossings brought service to Buckingham branch employees. And when we called Buckingham branch, they said, "We know you're building in the area. Come on down. What can we do to help you? We need that service." They move very efficiently. We put in an application and get it back within weeks. We resolve the flagging times. We do some of the same things that we do with Norfolk Southern and CSX and the other railroads, but the locals who are benefiting from the service and understand the need are reacting very differently and very quickly. And we know you can. And I mentioned earlier that I think their systems have kind of been overwhelmed and they weren't ready for it. So in some cases, we'll get an email approving an agreement, and it'll be 6 weeks, 8 weeks before we get the actual agreement. And we'll call and say, do we have, yeah, we're waiting on this. And there are folks these are large organizations, most of them with centralized handling, whether they're sitting in Nebraska, which is a wonderful state. But when we call and say we're looking for the crossing permit at Covesville, they're looking for a GPS location. And then when we mention that there's one just 1 mile away and we could do them at the same time, they said, well, we don't look at them that way. That one came in 3 months later, so it's backed up in the plan. And if there are ways that we can expedite some of this and get them to move a little quicker and also to gain some of those efficiencies. This past weekend, we did have a little breakthrough. This past weekend, we scheduled 8 crossings on one weekend.
Wow.
Some of those had been delayed over a year. But we were able to finally find a couple of folks and say, look, these are close enough together. When you get flaggers, it's difficult to get flaggers. They're having a hard time with labor. Let's schedule them and make the most use of them. So we were able to do some things, but the railroads became the hang up partly because they weren't ready for this, and then they didn't react. It just sat. When
Right.
we complained,
Well,
it sat there. So
a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them. We're starting to get some questions here. This is a great point about, look, priorities, right? And we in the broadband field, right? I mean, we are a news organization, and we do news and events around broadband. So obviously we're attuned to that. You all kind of are approaching broadband. And so, you can sort of understand if it's not on your radar, it doesn't rise to that level. But again, the great beauty of our American system of democracy, representative government, they're checks and balances, right? So when there's a problem, you have a check and a balance, right? And so we heard a little bit about that. Even the federal system itself is a check and a balance, because the federal, there's federal laws, and these are, there's state laws around railroads. You've referred to Virginia and Illinois, Alan. I wonder if you could just talk a minute about what's the kind of benchmark, what's the default rule in most states or most states in which this is an issue, Alan? And then is there any kind of long existing federal preemption that allows or gives you hope that the bill that Caroline has talked about from Representative Balderson could actually kind of get in there and make progress as a federal alternative to state law? So let's, again, all three of you, but let's start with Alan on this one.
Well, I think that it's useful to look at the Pole Attachment Act as an analog. That was, in full disclosure, I've represented and still do utilities on the other side of that. But I'll let Caroline speak more to the authority to do so. But as we're seeing with the patchwork of net neutrality regulations, there is a need to have this process somewhat similar in all states. I kind of went through some of the trends of what we're seeing. The things that they do look at are sort of the easy things to control, like the baseline.
What's the proximate cause for the Virginia law? What led, in your view, to that being passed, and now obviously it's in court? And can you just give us a little timeline of the Virginia one as an example, Alan?
Well, I think it's the federal funding. I think that, NTIA has tried to shape policy by, looking more favorably upon states which are trying to break down barriers in deployment, and Virginia responded. Obviously the railroads are litigating this, and I can't really say when that's going to be resolved, but we're going to be waiting around for a little while to see it go through. I will say that typically railroads have not succeeded in saying that this issue is preempted from the federal side in terms of, the federal railway authorities.
All right, Caroline.
Yeah, and I just want to take a little step back to something you said earlier in your question of, if this doesn't rise to the top, do people pay attention to it? And we saw that on our lobby day. A lot of the members, and they were leaders of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, leaders of the Senate Commerce Committee, they weren't really aware of this issue because their providers weren't telling them about it. And I had one specific office tell me after I went to theirs with this bill, and they said, "Oh, we don't think this is an issue. We'll go talk to our telcos and we'll see what they say." She came back and said, "I met with 7, and they said this is their #1 barrier to deployment." And I asked them, "Why didn't you tell us about this? These are things that we can help you with. We're your member of Congress. Like, this is our job." And they said, "Well, it's a railroads. We just thought it's business as usual and you can't do anything because it's how it is." And that's the line of thinking. And so that's why we're saying, no, it shouldn't be this way. We should have a regulatory framework and we can get to a solution. So now drawing awareness on these and having our members specifically come to the Hill, tell their members of Congress these stories to say, like, this is a huge impediment to deployment. There are billions of dollars you have allocated to bridge the digital divide. These dollars need to be spent wisely. This is a problem. They're listening.
Right.
So that's what we found, is just making sure that they're aware and knowing that there is a solution. Now, our solution is narrower in scope because Gary mentioned 15 different issues with the railroads. So you can't tackle them all, but I think you need to start somewhere. And that's what we're trying to do at Encompass.
Gary, do you want to add anything to this topic?
Yeah, just real quickly, from my perspective, what came up in Virginia came from the Trade Association of Electric Co-ops who have broadband affiliates, the Virginia, Maryland, Delaware Broadband Co-op Association. Last year, we as a group decided that we needed to do something to get a solution. And we knew it was a big lift to take on the railroads in Richmond with a legislative effort. But as we went down there and started talking to legislators, and we had Senator Bill Stanley, who really understood the issue and understood railroads, took a lead for us. But we found a coalition. We ended up with 27 different groups speaking for the bill in committee, and they ranged from right wing to left wing. They ranged from Dominion Power to Verizon to the electric co-ops. We had cable associations. We had a lot of different people expressing the concern. And at one point in one of the committee meetings, one of the legislators, as the railroads came up, asked, "Would you like a blindfold and a cigarette?" Because it was obvious that there were 27, there was a whole state that was seeing a problem, and the railroads, their approach was to talk about how it wasn't a problem, about how efficient they were and how many they processed. They just didn't even see the issue, and that's why they hadn't addressed it. And this is going to help push it. So
again, feel free to jump in. I'm going to try to take some of these questions. Chris Kramer puts in the question and answer bar, and I ask you to put them there so we can upvote. People can see them all. A few of our clients use Dave Thomas Eagle One resource to push their railroad permits. We would design the crossing permit for railroad specs, send it to that company, and they would kind of argue any fees out of line, and he's giving a kind of endorsement for that. So let's just talk a little bit about this. It sounds like one of the concerns we're hearing is that everyone's kind of delegating this issue to someone else. Like you all, it's so complicated, you have to kind of have your set of consultants, and the railroads are kind of doing the same. And so maybe it's just, is that a problem? Could you speak just a little bit about how we sort through, what are the systems that can be put in place? And maybe a solution here, Gary, is the role of the state broadband office, right? What could Dr. Tamara Holmes, who's a real leader, as the head of the Virginia office, she's a real leader among the state broadband officers. What role can they play in kind of cutting through this delay? So again, who wants to tackle this question of the delegation of responsibility issue?
Well, I'll be glad to just touch on a couple of things.
Please.
First of all, we haven't used Eagle One, but I have heard of them, and they have come recommended from some others. They have a number of former railroad folks who work for them down in Atlanta. That certainly helps. And I think that they can provide some grease to some of the friction points in terms of helping try to negotiate through whether it's Norfolk Southern or the contractor Norfolk Southern uses, which is RailPros, to actually manage the permitting process. But our point, while there are good teams to do that, and they have some success, is that shouldn't be what you have to depend on. There should be a standard process. You shouldn't have to go find the secret path or the Sherpa to lead you through it. And so going back also to the state broadband office, Dr. Holmes and her team do just an amazing job of managing the grants. They have a lot on their plate, and they've been very careful not to take on sides of too much of these types of issues and let the legislative process play out. But they are willing to make the point that the deadlines are real and that we have to get this constructed. So there have to be solutions.
Well, and it's interesting to see a mechanism that's come up in other areas of communication law, like the shot clock, right? When cell tower providers got super frustrated with municipalities, and again, kind of, we probably all worked on different sides of this. I see the arguments on both sides, and cities feel kind of bulldozed a lot of times by telecom wireless companies. But at the same time, they were able to get into the 2020 Budget Act a shot clock provision that requires municipalities to act within a certain time. And that seems to be the framework that we're working on here, or at least is being discussed. We've got a great question from Brandon Dittman. I want to read that out for those who are not on Zoom. Brandon says he's an attorney in Colorado, represents municipalities and Colorado municipal utilities, and has been dealing with this issue some time. Welcome to the issue. He says his question is, on both the Virginia legislation and the proposed federal legislation, is what is the interaction with the Interstate Commerce Commission's Termination Act of 1996, which I'm gathering, Alan, you can speak to, is presumably an issue that brings some federal jurisdiction into this question of railroad rights of way. And Brandon Dittman is saying that legislation preempts nearly all states and local railway regulation. So could you speak to his point about little progress will be made until the ICCTA is dealt with? Alan first, but let's hear it from everyone.
Briefly, that to my understanding is that preemption is not absolute, and in other areas, I don't know about Colorado circuit, the providers have successfully argued that this does not rise to the level of regulating the actual railway business. It's a state law property matter, just like if somebody gets hurt or killed, God forbid, on a railway project, that's a state law tort wrongful death thing. But I don't know that we've reached consensus yet. And one thing we've seen with railroad disputes is many times railroads have not wanted to call the question. That's one of the reasons approaches like Dave Thomas's and Eagle One work is, if we get final answers to these questions, they're final. That's what's so interesting about the Virginia legislation.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, you're saying that who doesn't want final decisions on this? The railroads or the people who help?
Double-edged sword, it's classic. You settle a lawsuit, nobody admits anything's wrong one way or the other, and there's no final rule. But I think that time may be ending.
Got it. These questions. Got it. A lot of settlements, so not as much law as there should be on this topic. Exactly. Okay. Caroline and Gary, what would you say to this question?
Well, our federal bill, I don't believe we mention this provision at all, so we don't directly deal with it. But what our legislation does do, it does create a rulemaking between the FCC and the FRA to deal with these, to create a framework so we can avoid these issues going forward. And as I mentioned before, it is narrower in scope, mainly just addressing the public right-of-way usage and going under the tracks, and it doesn't deal with anything longitudinal. But this framework, that's why it's important. That's where we're going to get that consistent regulatory lens, so everyone is playing by the same rules, and that's again why we're pushing for that.
Gary, go ahead.
I'm afraid you're beyond the edges of my ability to discuss this when you get into federal law versus state law, other than having an opinion, and the opinion's worth what you would pay for it. But I do think we have to have a way to put up some guardrails, and that's what we've talked about. In this case, as was pointed out earlier, the railroads have a way to go back and say $2,000 isn't enough, or $1,000 in this area is not enough, and go to the State Corporation Commission and show the value and receive that. But it does encourage them to move quickly. Give us the permit. go back and settle the price later if that cost is an issue. But let us get moving. We've got broadband that we have to build, and the clock is ticking. And you're talking about a shot clock. If the funding goes back to Washington, the shot clock is definitely gone off, and we all lose.
Mhm.
What do you think to this point? This is a good one that I've recalled hearing about, which is that it's the property aspects as opposed to the contract aspects that give the railroads that leverage. And if you could just kind of trespass and then pay the damages, it would not rise to the issue of a potentially extortionate prices, but at the same time it would get these things going, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, again, Alan, Caroline, if you want to answer anything on that point in particular, and what that could bear on how we find a solution to this problem.
Sure. Well, the model that you described where you just go do it and then pay is basically kind of like inverse condemnation. And really what we have to get at is what's the nature of this right of way. Now, there's no one type of railroad right of way. Sometimes you can do some digging and figure out they don't really have the right, for example, to exclude you this use of this property. Like if they only have an easement going over somebody's land and they don't have the right to exclude other uses, then they may not have legal grounds to charge anything or say no, except to the extent necessary to protect the railway. But that's really case by case and can be really expensive. And it would be better to have a more uniform determination of what are the types of railroad rights of way, what should they be able to say no and yes to.
Is there any merit for any kind of federal review and even kind of setting prices the way the FCC has been asked to do on the pole attachments issue and costs for pole attachment improvements?
Well, it's hard not to see an analog, and it'd be interesting to see just how much would carry over, including would you have a reverse preemption to let states do it their own way. I haven't looked into the jurisdictional issues, but the benefits to the federal approach is uniformity. Nobody gets left behind, and we can try and identify as many common issues as possible. There's an efficiency to that.
I should add that we recently produced one of our monthly reports for our Broadband Breakfast Club members. It was on the issue of pole attachments, but we had an additional section on railroad rights of way. So I encourage those of you who are interested in that topic to look to that. We're coming close to our hour, and barring any additional last minute surprise questions, I want to give each of you a chance to weigh in. And maybe my last question for you all is, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this does boil down to dollars and cents, and how do you kind of get to a Pareto optimal solution where each party's rights, even property rights, are recognized. And I think you've raised some good points, Alan, about how legitimate are horizontal rights of way if there is a right of way for the public. Why should that even be kind of part of the mix? But put that aside, is there some way to get at a kind of a dollar and cents number that makes sense? Is that a case by case? Is it a statewide decision? Is there a role for the federal government? But don't limit your final statements to that only. I want to hear what Gary and Caroline and Alan think are potential solutions from the broadband perspective to solving this railroad crossing issue. So Gary, your final thoughts.
So the dollars and cents are certainly important. It's expensive to build out in the rural areas. That's why we have the grant programs to help offset those costs. And I think we need to come up with a reasonable amount that we pay for the use of that right away and for the impact that putting the fiber up has on it. But I would say that the more important aspect right now is the speed of response and the ability to move these quickly. We have gone through about 40 permits in the last 5 years. We've got about 100 to go through in the next 2 years. And we're just one small provider. They're doing that times 10 across the state of Virginia, and they're doing that in North Carolina and Georgia. And so the railroads need to have some encouragement to revise their processes and move quickly. And I think looking at the tools we have, put up those guardrails and say, you've got to help us here. We've got to cross your tracks. Find a way that we can do this safely and quickly and efficiently and on some type of expected timeline, not put in the application and get something a year later.
Thank you for spending this time to be with us, Gary, and for bringing your perspective. Thank you. Caroline, what are your final thoughts on this topic?
And I agree with Gary. Time is a huge cost as well. And that's why, again, our legislation deals directly with that. In the rulemaking, it encourages a speedy deployment and puts those parameters on that. If you already have sufficient authority to be in that right of way, what our legislation is saying is you don't need more authority from the railroad. Just give them a 10-day heads up and then roll. And that's a very specific instance again.
Right.
And then in regard to the cost, what we're saying is we understand that in different terrains and different situations, you might not be able to have a uniform fee. So what we're saying is that fee needs to be based on actual reasonable costs that is directly related to that specific deployment and nothing more. Because I'm sorry, what are we paying $47,000 for one thing? It's just completely ludicrous. So that's where our language really does come in and try to be responsible on both ends and not just say, okay, we don't owe you anything when in fact we might, but let's make it reasonable.
Great. Thank you for lending your perspective and these interesting stories about the lessons learned from your fly-ins and raising this issue. That was a wonderful point worth repeating. You get the last word, Alan. What's the kind of solution to this knotty problem?
So we are identifying, I think, as many categories of easy yeses and easy nos as we can, but there's no way we're going to solve everything. And I think, there is a sort of, there is a sense that, hey, railroads, we've been giving you a chance to have your say. If you're not going to participate, we're regulating, we're going forward. I hope to see entities like state broadband offices continue to try and bring people together, because what I want to see is an accelerated process compared to like the pole attachment world, which we saw develop kind of slowly, where we go from a point where there's this adversarial, you took something from us, to, okay, we're partners, we're all in this together, and have this coordination continue where we can develop new processes we never thought of before, or just help people have the tools they need to get started and plan up front the right way.
Well, that will have to be our last word. On behalf of our panelists, Alan Poole, Carolyn Olson, Gary Wood, we will see you next week at this time for cybersecurity and BEAD. And for those of you who'd like to make it to New York for Vaughn Evolution, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.